I smelled the smoke before I saw the fire. Thick, sweet, wrong. When I pushed through the trees, the swamp opened up into a nightmare lit by orange flames and phone flashlights. Tents covered the ground like a cheap music festival. Strangers were laughing on my grandfather's protected land, kids running barefoot near black water that swallowed light, and every warning sign we had posted was torn down and tossed into the mud. Someone had even used one as firewood. I just stood there, frozen, watching suburban families roast marshmallows beside nesting areas that federal officers had once guarded. Then I saw her. Victoria Crowley, clipboard in hand, smiling like she owned the place, telling people everything was approved. My chest tightened when the water rippled. A long, scaled back slid just beneath the surface, silent and close. These people thought the signs were decoration. A man laughed when I shouted. A child threw bread toward the shoreline. When I stepped forward, Victoria pointed at me and called me unstable, said I was trespassing on community land. That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't confusion. This was a takeover. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fence Line File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The swamp was never just land to me. It breathed. That is the only way I know how to explain it. In the early mornings, before the sun pushed the fog away, the air would hum with insects and distant bird calls, and the water would move like it had its own slow heartbeat. My grandfather, Elias Hale, used to say wetlands were not empty spaces. They were crowded cities we simply did not understand. He spent decades protecting this place when nobody else cared. While developers saw useless mud, he saw migration routes, nesting grounds, and fragile systems that collapsed if you touched them the wrong way. Long before I inherited the property, he had already fought the legal battles. He secured a federal conservation easement that locked the land into protection, paperwork thicker than a brick, signatures from agencies most people never hear about. The swamp could not be developed, could not be drained, could not be reshaped for convenience. It was meant to remain alive long after we were gone. Living there felt different from living anywhere else. The humidity clung to your skin, frogs sang at dusk like clockwork, and the smell of wet earth never truly left your clothes. It was messy and beautiful and honest. Across the narrow drainage ditch, though, stood a completely different world. Riverbend Estates looked like it had been ironed flat. Lawns trimmed to identical heights, mailboxes polished, sidewalks spotless. Even the trees seemed arranged by committee. Their homeowners association prided itself on visual harmony, which I later learned meant control disguised as order. At first, the contrast felt harmless. Two worlds separated by a few yards of water. They had their symmetry. I had my wilderness. No conflict seemed necessary. Victoria Crowley entered my life smiling. That is what makes it almost funny now. The first time I met her, she introduced herself as a community organizer, not a leader, not an enforcer. She complimented the birds she could hear from her porch and said she admired my commitment to nature. Her tone was warm, polished, practiced. She spoke often about community image and shared standards, phrases that sounded harmless until you heard them repeated enough times to realize they were not casual. They were policy in disguise. Still, nothing in that first conversation hinted at hostility. If anything, she seemed overly friendly, the type of neighbor who brought brochures instead of cookies. The letters started quietly, neat envelopes in my mailbox with printed headers and cheerful language. Suggestions, not demands. Requests, not orders. They mentioned things like unsightly wildlife structures, referring to educational signposts my grandfather had installed decades ago. One even attached a glossy drone photo of my shoreline with a red circle drawn around a nesting barrier. I remember laughing when I first saw it. My land was not part of Riverbend Estates. Their rules had no jurisdiction here. I trusted the legality the same way a person trusts gravity. Solid. Unquestionable. I set the letters aside and went back to repairing a wooden boardwalk near the water's edge. But small details began to itch at the back of my mind. The drone photos were getting closer, sharper. Someone was flying low enough to read the tags on protected trees. Another letter mentioned community view corridors, implying my fencing disrupted neighborhood aesthetics. That was the first time irritation replaced amusement. I still ignored it, but the humor was gone. A week later, an older man from Riverbend named Leonard Whitmore stopped by while I was fixing a trail marker. He spoke in a low voice, glancing over his shoulder like he was confessing something criminal. He warned me the HOA liked to stretch boundaries, that they had a history of absorbing problems until they became theirs. I thanked him, but inside I dismissed it as suburban exaggeration. People always thought their local boards were dictatorships. It sounded dramatic, not dangerous. Then the official notice arrived. No cheerful greeting, no friendly tone. A formal document citing community view standard violations and referencing my perimeter fence. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh again. Almost. My property was not inside their mapped jurisdiction. The fence predated most of their houses. Yet the language was confident, authoritative, rehearsed. It did not read like a mistake. It read like a script someone had practiced in front of a mirror. That was the moment the unease settled in for real. I stood on my porch holding the paper, listening to the cicadas scream in the trees, and realized this was not random interference. It was organized. The words were too polished, the accusations too specific. It felt like I had been cast in a play without auditioning, handed lines I never agreed to speak. And for the first time, the swamp did not just feel alive. It felt watched. I did not hear them arrive. The swamp usually warns you when people approach. Branches snap, birds scatter, water shifts. That morning it stayed strangely quiet. I was kneeling near the boardwalk, replacing a warped plank, when a shadow fell across the wood. I looked up and saw polished shoes where muddy boots should have been. Victoria Crowley stood at the edge of the trail with two people behind her, both holding clipboards like shields. No greeting, no hesitation. They had already stepped past the boundary markers, as if the land had invited them in. "What are you doing on my property?" I asked, standing slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Inspection," Victoria replied, the word crisp and rehearsed. "We've received multiple community safety concerns." I actually glanced behind me, half expecting a camera crew to jump out and yell that it was a prank. Inspection. Safety concerns. On federally protected wetlands that had been documented for decades. The absurdity hit first, then irritation. I told them they had no jurisdiction here. Victoria smiled the way people smile when they are about to tell a child they are wrong. She produced a laminated sheet from her folder and held it up like a badge. Temporary environmental jurisdiction, it read, citing vague statutes that looked photocopied and stretched. The seal in the corner was blurred. The signature line had a printed name instead of ink. "That document is fake," I said, more confused than angry at first. Her smile thinned. "Sir, we're authorized to evaluate risks that affect Riverbend families. Your swamp presents multiple hazards to community children." The word "your" came out like an accusation. Something in my chest tightened. This was no longer about signs or fences. It was ownership language, territory language. I told them again to leave. Victoria stepped forward instead, heel sinking slightly into the damp soil, but she didn't flinch. That was the moment disbelief turned into anger. She wasn't mistaken. She was confident. My cousin Miles emerged from the side trail then, carrying a toolbox. He stopped when he saw them, eyes narrowing. Miles had spent enough weekends repairing platforms and clearing invasive plants to know every inch of that land. He asked what was going on, and Victoria shifted her tone instantly, addressing him like a disruptive bystander rather than family. She spoke about fines, liabilities, legal consequences. The words poured out smoothly, polished, theatrical. It was authority as performance, not substance. "You're trespassing," Miles said plainly. "We are preventing danger," Victoria replied, just as plainly, but louder. A voice drifted from the tree line behind them. "Elias fought this before." June Whitaker stepped into view, leaning on her cane. She lived on the outskirts of Riverbend and had known my grandfather longer than most of the board members had known their own mortgages. Her presence changed the air. Victoria's expression flickered for half a second, irritation cracking through the polished surface. June spoke calmly, reminding them that the conservation easement had already survived multiple legal challenges years ago. She remembered hearings, judges, documents thicker than dictionaries. Victoria thanked her with a smile that never reached her eyes and dismissed her memory as outdated. They left eventually, but not before Victoria handed me a printed notice about potential penalties. The paper felt heavier than it should have. That afternoon I told myself it was bluster. Empty threats wrapped in formal fonts. I was wrong. Within a week, the letters multiplied. What had been occasional envelopes became a steady stream. Citations for visual disruption, warnings about unmanaged wildlife, even suggestions that my educational kiosks were attracting unwanted species. The language grew sharper, less polite. One morning I walked the perimeter and noticed 3 warning signs were gone. Not fallen, removed. The metal posts were bent sideways like someone had twisted them free. 2 nights later, a section of fencing was cut clean through, not torn by animals but sliced by tools. That was when I installed cameras. Small ones, hidden in tree knots and mounted under platform rails. The first footage showed nothing unusual. Raccoons, herons, the usual nighttime movement. Then a clip appeared of 2 silhouettes near the boundary line, one pointing, the other pulling a sign loose. The timestamp read just after midnight. The next day, Riverbend's online community board lit up with posts labeling me a public nuisance. Someone shared drone images of my shoreline with captions about declining property values. The comments stacked quickly, strangers discussing my land as if it were a broken fence on their own street. Social pressure replaced paperwork. It felt like standing in a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided by people who had never stepped inside. I began noticing eyes on me when I drove past the entrance to Riverbend. Conversations quieted. A man mowing his lawn paused to stare too long. None of it was overt, but it was coordinated. Absurd bureaucracy had shifted into something more targeted, more personal. I was no longer a neighbor outside their borders. I was an obstacle inside their narrative. The inciting blow came on a bright afternoon when I opened my mailbox and found a glossy flyer folded in thirds. The paper smelled faintly of fresh ink. Across the top, in cheerful green letters, it read, Riverbend Wilderness Family Retreat. Beneath it were smiling stock photos of tents and marshmallows, and at the bottom, my stomach dropped, a map with exact coordinates. My coordinates. Dates, schedules, activity lists. Experience nature safely, it promised. The swamp, my grandfather's protected land, reduced to a weekend attraction. I stood there holding the flyer while cicadas screamed in the trees, realizing this was no longer harassment at the edges. It was an announcement. An invitation sent to dozens of families to occupy land they had been told was theirs. The script I had sensed earlier was no longer hidden. It was printed in color and mailed to an entire neighborhood. The flyer stopped feeling hypothetical the moment the first SUV rolled onto the dirt access road with a kayak strapped to its roof. By noon, there were a dozen vehicles. By sunset, the swamp looked like a campground brochure that had been dropped into the wrong reality. Tents bloomed between cypress roots. Folding chairs scraped across protected soil. Coolers thumped down beside nesting zones marked with faded tape someone had already peeled away. Children ran in circles chasing each other with glow sticks while parents snapped photos and posted captions about discovering hidden nature. Every laugh felt like a trespass. Every footstep pressed deeper than it should have. Victoria called it a community nature weekend. The phrase spread quickly, repeated like a harmless tradition instead of a coordinated occupation. When I phoned the local police, I tried to keep my voice steady, explaining federal easements, wildlife permits, legal boundaries. The officer arrived, walked the perimeter, glanced at the stack of printed HOA paperwork Victoria handed him, and used the words civil confusion. He suggested mediation. He suggested patience. He suggested I avoid confrontation. Then he left, tires crunching over gravel that had never belonged to Riverbend Estates. Community opinion shifted almost overnight. Victoria moved through the crowd like a host at a festival, smiling, pointing out educational opportunities, telling anyone who asked that I was overreacting. By evening, I overheard someone say I hated children. Another said I was anti-nature. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so effective. They turned stewardship into hostility with a few sentences and a confident tone. I felt my grandfather's name being quietly rewritten in conversations I could not interrupt. Sleep disappeared first. I sat in front of camera feeds long after midnight, the blue glow carving shadows into the walls of my small living room. Every flicker of movement pulled my eyes open wider. I watched strangers wander through areas my grandfather once mapped with survey flags and handwritten notes. I watched someone drag a cooler across a platform Elias had built plank by plank. Miles tried to keep me grounded, bringing coffee, reminding me to breathe, but even he started receiving hostility. One afternoon, a resident stepped close to him near the boundary line and muttered that accidents happen in swamps. It was said casually, almost politely, which somehow made it worse. Then the signboards were vandalized. The wooden panels Elias had carved decades ago. Diagrams of migratory birds, explanations of wetland ecosystems, were scratched, cracked, and tagged with jokes about monster reptiles. I ran my hand across the splintered surface and felt the grooves of his lettering under the damage. It was not just wood. It was memory. The anger that rose in me was sharp and immediate, but it had nowhere clean to land. I could not arrest a crowd. I could not fence an ideology. The near accident happened at dusk. A small boy wandered off the main path chasing dragonflies and slipped toward a restricted pond where the bank dropped suddenly. I shouted and sprinted before his father even noticed. I caught the child's arm just as his foot slid into the water, heart hammering against my ribs. Instead of gratitude, the father pulled him away and glared at me like I had interfered with a family photo. Later that night, Victoria told a circle of parents that I had frightened a child unnecessarily. The story bent in her favor before it had time to stand straight. I attended an HOA meeting hoping for reason. The room smelled like coffee and lemon polish. Chairs lined up in neat rows, a projector humming softly. When I presented the conservation easement documents, Victoria smiled and thanked me for my passion. The board members laughed when I mentioned federal protections, not loudly, just enough to turn the air dismissive. One man suggested I join a committee if I wanted constructive involvement. Another asked if I had considered selling. My words landed like feathers on glass. They heard them, but nothing changed. Back at the swamp, the tension grew physical. I discovered fresh bonfire pits dug too close to nesting areas, ash scattered where fragile grasses should have been untouched. The ground still radiated heat when I crouched beside it. I filled one pit with water using a bucket, hands shaking more from restraint than exhaustion. I wanted to shout, to force them to see what they were damaging, but every confrontation fed the narrative Victoria had built, that I was unstable, dramatic, unreasonable. So I swallowed the anger and documented everything, each photograph another silent argument stacked in a folder no one had opened yet. Days blurred into each other. Laughter drifted across the water at night. Flashlights bobbed like distant stars. I felt cornered in my own inheritance, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people treating the land as if consensus equaled ownership. Miles kept watch with me some evenings, binoculars resting on the railing. We spoke less and listened more, the swamp's usual chorus drowned beneath human noise. On the fourth night, I lifted the binoculars and scanned the shoreline. At first, I saw only reflections, firelight trembling on black water. Then the shape emerged, slow and deliberate. A long, familiar back broke the surface near the reeds, the tag number catching a glint of light. The main alligator had shifted closer, drawn by movement and food scraps and curiosity. He floated there, patient, ancient, exactly where the warning signs had once stood. My breath stalled. The crowd behind the tents kept laughing, unaware that the line between spectacle and consequence had already begun to move. I reached the point where anger stopped being loud and started becoming precise. That change began with a phone call I should have made weeks earlier. Daniel Mercer answered on the third ring, his voice exactly the same as it had been years ago in university lecture halls. Calm, measured, impossible to rush. We had studied wildlife biology together, spent late nights arguing about conservation policies and drinking cheap coffee while sketching migration maps on napkins. Now he was a state wildlife enforcement officer, the kind of position that came with both authority and patience. I told him everything in one breath. The flyers, the tents, the forged paperwork, the bonfires near nesting zones. When I finished, there was a pause long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat in the silence. "Rowan," he finally said, "that easement is ironclad. Federal level. They don't just hand those out and forget them. If what you're saying is accurate, they have zero jurisdiction. Less than zero, actually." The relief hit like a physical force, followed immediately by a sharper realization. I had been arguing emotion against performance when I should have been arguing law against fiction. Daniel asked me to send scans of every document Victoria had shown me. 10 minutes later he called back, and this time there was no pause. "These are not just invalid," he said. "Some of this looks fabricated." Sloppy too. Fabricated. The word shifted the ground beneath everything. It meant this was not misunderstanding. It was deliberate construction. Daniel promised to review the boundaries personally and said he could coordinate enforcement presence if environmental risks escalated. For the first time since the tents appeared, I felt the air clear inside my lungs. That same afternoon, I drove to the county records office, a quiet brick building that smelled like paper and dust and fluorescent lighting. I requested archived HOA filings out of instinct more than strategy, flipping through folders with the detached curiosity of someone looking for confirmation rather than discovery. Then I found her name, Victoria Crowley. Not once, but twice. Years earlier, in another district, attached to a dispute involving public access land that had mysteriously shifted under community pressure. The case notes were dry, bureaucratic, but the pattern was unmistakable. She had tried this before. Different location, same language. Same arguments about shared safety and visual harmony. The previous attempt had collapsed under legal scrutiny. She had not stopped. She had simply moved. When I stepped outside into the afternoon heat, the world looked sharper, edges more defined. The chaos I had been drowning in suddenly had outlines. It had structure. And anything with structure could be dismantled. That night, I began documenting with intention instead of desperation. Cameras multiplied along the boundary lines, small lenses hidden in bark crevices and beneath railings. I cataloged every instance of trespass, every removed sign, every shovel mark near restricted zones. I organized timestamps, cross-referenced them with posted HOA announcements, built timelines that showed coordination instead of coincidence. The work was meticulous and strangely calming. Each file was a brick, each folder a wall. The narrative they had constructed about me started to feel fragile, like paper in humidity. Through an old contact, I reached Isla Bennett, an investigative journalist whose articles about corrupt boards and inflated management contracts had circulated widely in local news circles. I expected skepticism. Instead, she listened without interrupting. When I mentioned the archived records with Victoria's name attached, her tone sharpened with interest. She did not promise headlines or outrage. She promised questions, which felt more powerful. We agreed to communicate quietly. No announcements, no leaks. Evidence first, exposure later. The emotional shift inside me was subtle but decisive. The fear that had been vibrating under every decision steadied into focus. I was no longer reacting to noise. I was arranging facts. Even the swamp seemed to respond differently. The nighttime sounds returned to their familiar rhythm, frogs and insects reclaiming space from distant laughter. I installed additional cameras near the shoreline and coordinated with Daniel about potential wildlife officer standby if safety thresholds were crossed. The preparation was quiet, almost invisible, but it changed the balance in ways the campers could not see. Miles noticed the difference before I did. He said I looked less tired, which was not entirely true, but I understood what he meant. The exhaustion no longer felt like helplessness. It felt like effort directed somewhere specific. I stopped watching every live feed obsessively and started reviewing footage like an analyst rather than a witness. Patterns emerged, repeated faces, recurring vehicles, scheduled activities aligning too neatly with HOA announcements. The occupation was not spontaneous. It was orchestrated. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the water, I stood on the old platform Elias had built and looked over the wetland. The campers' lights flickered in the distance, but they felt smaller somehow, like background noise instead of an invading force. I thought about my grandfather filing paperwork under dim lamps, about hearings and signatures and the patience it must have taken to protect a place most people considered expendable. The land had endured storms, droughts, shifting property lines, and the slow pressure of development. It had outlasted louder threats than this. A quiet certainty settled in. The swamp had protected itself for generations through resilience and documentation written long before I ever stepped onto its soil. Now it was my turn to do the same, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with the same tools Elias had trusted: records, law, and steady resolve. I did not need to outshout them. I only needed to outlast them, and to prove, line by line, that this land had never been theirs to claim. Once the plan existed, everything changed shape. Daniel and I stopped reacting and started positioning. Surveillance became less about catching moments and more about mapping behavior. We set overlapping camera angles along the boundary lines so no single blind spot could be exploited. Some were obvious enough to discourage casual trespass. Others were nearly invisible, tucked into hollow knots and beneath platform beams where only deliberate searching would reveal them. The first week of footage was chaotic but revealing. Patterns began to form the way constellations do, scattered points suddenly connecting into something intentional. The same vehicles appeared after midnight. The same figures walked directly to signposts, not wandering, not curious, but purposeful. One clip showed a committee member twisting a warning sign free with both hands, glancing over their shoulder before tossing it into the back of a pickup truck. Another captured two silhouettes stepping past the rope barrier near a nesting zone, laughing softly as if the land itself could not hear them. Daniel reviewed the clips with the calm focus of someone accustomed to sorting truth from noise. He tagged timestamps, cross-referenced faces with public HOA directories, and built a quiet case that spoke louder than any argument I could have shouted. There was no outrage in his tone, only clarity. "This is deliberate," he said once, pointing to a frame where a flashlight beam traced the edge of a protected area before crossing it anyway. The difference between ignorance and intent was now recorded in high definition. While the cameras gathered evidence at night, Isla Bennett worked during the day. She approached Riverbend Estates like an accountant studying a ledger, not a reporter chasing drama. Her calls were polite, her emails clinical, but the questions she asked had weight. Within 2 weeks, she found irregularities in the HOA's financial statements, management fees that ballooned without explanation, maintenance contracts awarded to companies that shared mailing addresses, legal funds allocated to community expansion studies that no resident remembered approving. She did not publish anything yet. She simply collected, verified, and stacked facts like stones in a foundation. When we spoke, her voice carried the quiet excitement of someone uncovering a pattern that could not easily be denied. I began speaking to residents one by one, never in groups, never confrontational. Conversations happened near mailboxes, at the edge of sidewalks, beside parked cars where the air felt neutral. Many admitted they believed the swamp already belonged to Riverbend. They had been told it was a shared green space waiting for development approval. The misinformation was not shouted. It had been repeated casually until it sounded like truth. Some residents apologized when they learned the reality. Others looked embarrassed, as if they had wandered into a story halfway through and suddenly realized they were on the wrong side. These quiet admissions were small victories, but they shifted something important. The crowd was no longer unified. Doubt had entered the room. The most unexpected piece of evidence came from a device no larger than a coin. Daniel had suggested placing a discreet audio recorder near the boundary trail where HOA members often gathered before walking the property. We positioned it inside a hollow wooden post that had once held a directional sign. Days passed without anything useful. Then one evening, as I reviewed the audio files, I heard Victoria's voice. Unmistakable, confident, relaxed in a way she never was in public meetings. She spoke about redefining borders like it was a creative project, not a legal impossibility. She laughed about paperwork being flexible if you repeated enough. The recording was not explosive, but it was revealing. It stripped away performance and left intention bare. Yet even as evidence accumulated, the opposition escalated. Riverbend Estates announced a massive public vote to classify the swamp as community risk land. The phrasing was clever, designed to sound protective rather than acquisitive, Flyers appeared on doorsteps and digital newsletters urged residents to attend, for the safety of families. The implication was clear: if the vote passed, they would attempt forced seizure through legal pressure and collective momentum. It did not matter that the vote held no actual jurisdiction. Optics could become leverage if left unanswered. Preparation shifted into higher gear. Daniel coordinated with wildlife enforcement officers to ensure a visible presence on the day of the vote, not as a threat, but as a reminder of legal boundaries. I finalized legal packets thick with timestamps, photographic evidence, conservation documents, and transcripts from the audio recordings. Isla compiled financial charts that transformed vague suspicions into precise numbers. Every piece of information found its place in a growing structure designed not to intimidate but to illuminate. The atmosphere became a chess match played across lawns and water lines instead of boards. Each move felt deliberate, each pause loaded with calculation. I noticed Victoria walking the neighborhood more frequently, speaking in clusters, her gestures sharper than before. She sensed resistance even if she did not yet know its shape. Meanwhile, the campers continued their routines, unaware that the ground beneath their festival was shifting from spectacle to scrutiny. Nights grew quieter inside me even as the swamp echoed with distant laughter. I stood on the platform with binoculars resting against my chest, watching firelight flicker between trees. The alligator's silhouette appeared occasionally near the reeds, a slow reminder that the land operated on older rules than any committee could invent. My calendar hung open on the kitchen wall, each day crossed out with a thin black line. The date of the vote, circled in red ink, felt less like a deadline and more like a meeting point where all these quiet preparations would finally intersect. As the days narrowed, the tension stopped feeling chaotic and started feeling precise. Evidence had weight now. Allies had names. The narrative that once surrounded me like fog was thinning into something navigable. Still, the laughter from across the water drifted through the night air, light and careless, a reminder that they believed the story was already written. I watched the calendar tick down one square at a time, listening to the echo of their campfires ripple across the swamp, knowing that when the final date arrived, the silence that followed would sound very different. The meeting hall looked like it was prepared for a celebration, not a confrontation. Streamers in muted greens hung along the walls, folding chairs arranged in perfect rows, a table near the entrance stacked with pamphlets about community unity and shared responsibility. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paint. It was unsettling how normal it all felt. Outside, just beyond the manicured lawns, my grandfather's swamp was still filled with tents and fire pits, the occupation continuing as if this vote would magically rewrite decades of law. Inside, neighbors chatted in low voices, smiling politely at one another, as though they were about to approve a new park bench rather than attempt to claim protected land. Victoria Crowley stood near the projector screen, perfectly composed. She wore the same confident smile she used when introducing neighborhood cleanup days and holiday events, the expression of someone who believed the room already belonged to her. Slides flickered behind her, showing aerial images of the wetland cropped carefully to emphasize shadows in murky water. Words like hazard, liability, and community safety appeared in large fonts. It was not an outright lie. It was a curated truth, arranged like furniture to guide where people sat emotionally. Every image was angled to look threatening. Every statistic floated without context. I entered quietly and chose a seat near the back. Daniel sat 2 chairs to my left, posture relaxed but eyes scanning the room with professional awareness. Isla was on my right, a small notebook resting on her knee, pen already uncapped. We did not speak. We did not need to. The whispers began almost immediately. Some were curious, others wary. A few faces held open hostility, the kind that forms when a story has been repeated so often it feels personal. I kept my folder closed on my lap, fingertips resting on the edges of the documents inside like they were anchors rather than weapons. Victoria started the presentation with practiced warmth, thanking everyone for coming, praising the collective effort to ensure a safe environment. Then her tone shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something sharper. She spoke about incidents near the waterline, about children wandering too close to danger, about the responsibility of leadership. My name appeared on the slide behind her without context, attached to phrases like unmanaged land and potential negligence. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She never raised her voice. She did not need to. The accusation was woven into the narrative, as if it had always been there. I felt the folder grow heavier in my hands, but forced myself to breathe evenly. The urge to stand up and correct every distortion pressed against my ribs, but timing mattered more than volume. Daniel's phone buzzed softly. He glanced down, then leaned slightly toward me. "They're staged nearby," he whispered, barely audible. Wildlife officers were in position. The confirmation settled inside me like a steadying weight. Outside, beyond the hall, the campers were still laughing, still treating the swamp like a backdrop for photographs. Inside, their presence was being transformed into justification. When Victoria opened the floor for comments, a few residents stood to repeat the same concern she had projected. Safety, property values, community rights. The words echoed each other with uncanny similarity. Then she turned directly toward me, her smile thinning into something almost sympathetic. "We all want what's best," she said, "but personal attachments cannot outweigh the welfare of families." It was not a question. It was a framing device. The room shifted subtly, bodies leaning forward, waiting for a reaction. I remained seated. I flipped open the folder just enough to check the order of the documents, the timestamps, the printed transcripts. Paper against paper made a soft, reassuring sound. Isla's pen moved once across her notebook. Daniel's gaze stayed on the front of the room. The restraint was deliberate. Every second stretched, thick with anticipation, the air feeling heavier than the decorations hanging from the walls. Victoria resumed speaking, guiding the room toward the vote. She explained the proposal to redefine the land boundaries under the label of community risk classification, a phrase that sounded protective while aiming for possession. Hands hovered near voting cards. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed. The projector hummed. Outside, distant laughter drifted faintly through the glass doors, a reminder of the parallel world continuing only yards away. The atmosphere became suffocating, not with noise but with expectation. I could sense the collective belief that the outcome was already decided, that momentum alone could bend reality. My phone vibrated once more. Daniel forwarding confirmation of officer positions. The folder on my lap no longer felt heavy. It felt precise. Victoria lifted her hand to call for the vote, her expression calm, certain, already celebrating a victory she believed inevitable. I looked around the room at faces I recognized from sidewalks and mailboxes, people who had been handed a story and never questioned its ending. The moment hung there, suspended between assumption and revelation. I rose from my chair slowly, the scrape of metal legs against the floor cutting clean through the murmurs, and in that instant, I knew it was time to act. I stood with the folder in my hands and felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me. Victoria paused mid-sentence, the confidence in her posture holding for a second too long, like a photograph that had been overexposed. I did not raise my voice. I did not point. I simply walked to the front, placed the folder on the table beside the projector, and opened it. Paper slid against wood with a soft, deliberate sound that somehow carried across the entire hall. "These are federal conservation easements," I said, turning the first page toward the audience rather than toward Victoria. "Filed decades ago, reviewed multiple times. They do not expire. They do not bend to community votes." The projector screen shifted from her curated slides to scanned documents stamped with seals that were unmistakably real. Dates older than most of the houses in Riverbend filled the wall behind me. Signatures from agencies no HOA committee could override. The room quieted in a way decorations never could. You could almost hear the moment collective assumption hesitated. Victoria stepped forward, smiling too quickly. She began to speak about interpretation, about shared safety, about how documents could be revisited. That was when Daniel connected his tablet to the system. The next image was not a seal or a date. It was night vision footage, a figure removing a warning sign. Another stepping past a rope barrier. Faces became recognizable when the zoom adjusted. The murmurs returned, sharper this time, threaded with recognition rather than agreement. I did not rush. Each piece followed the last with the same steady rhythm. Timestamps. Boundary lines. A sequence of stills that showed intent rather than accident. When the audio clip began, the room leaned forward as one body. Victoria's voice filled the speakers, relaxed, almost amused, speaking about redefining borders and repeating paperwork until it sounded true. There was no distortion, no editing trick. Just her tone, unmistakable, stripped of presentation polish. The words hung there, impossible to gather back. Isla stepped up beside me without ceremony. She placed a thin stack of printed charts on the table and spoke with the clarity of someone reading numbers rather than opinions. Management fees that doubled without approval. Contracts awarded to shell companies. Funds labeled as community expansion studies that had no deliverables attached. The projector showed lines rising where they should have been flat. The audience's silence changed shape again, this time edged with betrayal. People began turning to each other instead of toward the front. The doors at the back of the hall opened and uniformed wildlife officers entered with calm professionalism, not urgency. Their presence was not theatrical. It was procedural. One officer spoke briefly about environmental violations documented over the past weeks. Fire pits in restricted zones, disturbed nesting areas, unauthorized removal of federal signage. The language was clinical, but the implications were not. Victoria attempted denial then, words stacking faster, hands gesturing wider, but each sentence collided with something already on the screen or already in the room. Outside, a sudden commotion rippled through the open doors. Shouts. The scattered rhythm of people moving quickly. Someone near the entrance stepped out and returned seconds later, whispering that an alligator had surfaced near the shoreline. The word spread, faster than any slide ever had. Through the glass, you could see flickers of flashlight beams swinging erratically. Officers moved with practiced calm, guiding residents toward exits, instructing campers to clear the area. No panic was allowed to become chaos. It was orderly, controlled, exactly the response I had asked for weeks earlier when my warnings were treated like exaggeration. Inside, the shift was irreversible. Neighbors who had nodded along with Victoria now stared at the documents in front of them, or at her with expressions that held more distance than anger. Authority dissolved not with a shout, but with absence. The structure she had built out of repetition and confidence lost its center. Questions replaced applause. The vote cards remained on laps, untouched. A board member quietly stepped away from the table. Another avoided eye contact altogether. Daniel played the audio clip again, this time only a short segment, enough to remove any remaining doubt. Victoria's shoulders dropped a fraction. It was subtle, but in a room tuned to tension, it was visible. Legal consequences were mentioned by the officers in the same tone used to announce closing hours. Inevitable, procedural, already in motion. No one cheered. No one needed to. The outcome no longer depended on emotion. When the meeting dissolved, it did not explode. It unraveled. Chairs scraped softly. Conversations broke into low clusters. Papers were folded instead of thrown. Outside, the officers had already guided families away from the shoreline, their lights steady against the dark water. The campers packed with nervous efficiency, laughter replaced by the hurried rustle of fabric and zippers. The alligator's silhouette drifted back toward the reeds, indifferent to the drama it had unintentionally punctuated. I stepped out into the night air as sirens faded into the distance, the hall behind me emptying into quiet streets. The swamp stretched before me again, dark and breathing, its usual chorus returning one sound at a time. The tents were gone. The fire pits were cooling mounds of ash. The water reflected the moon without interruption. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the insects reclaim the silence, and felt the land settle back into itself, as if nothing had ever tried to rename it. The days after the meeting did not explode into drama the way I once imagined they might. They softened. News traveled quickly, but it moved like a tide instead of a storm. Within a week, the Riverbend HOA board announced an emergency restructuring. Within 2, half of its members had resigned. Victoria Crowley's departure was quieter than her arrival had ever been. No farewell speech, no final statement, just a moving truck at dawn and blinds drawn for the last time. The legal consequences unfolded with the slow certainty of paperwork finding its proper desk. Fines were issued for environmental violations. Civil suits appeared in county records. The process lacked spectacle, but it carried weight. Authority had not been crushed. It had simply been corrected. I returned to the swamp with tools instead of folders. The first task was the fencing, repairing clean cuts and reinforcing posts that had been twisted loose. Each hammer strike felt less like retaliation and more like restoration. I rebuilt the signboards that had been vandalized, carving the lettering deeper this time, sealing the wood against weather and neglect. New educational kiosks followed, designed with help from Daniel and a few local conservation volunteers. They bore my grandfather's name at the bottom, Elias Hale Wetland Preserve, not as a memorial, but as a continuation. Children who once ran blindly toward the water now stood reading diagrams about migratory birds and protected habitats. The land did not need applause. It needed understanding. The apologies began hesitantly. A woman left a handwritten note in my mailbox thanking me for stopping her son from slipping into the pond weeks earlier. A couple from Riverbend approached me while I was replacing a boundary rope and admitted they had believed the swamp was public space. They offered help instead of excuses. Soon, the offers multiplied. Weekend mornings brought small groups with gloves and trash bags, quietly collecting debris left behind by the retreat. No speeches, no banners. Just steady hands doing simple work. Cooperation replaced confrontation without needing to announce itself. The swamp's reputation shifted from nuisance to asset. Local schools requested guided walks. Bird watchers arrived with notebooks instead of drones. The same residents who once complained about unsightly wildlife structures began asking questions about seasonal changes and native plants. The contrast was not dramatic. It was gradual, like watching water clear after mud settles. Respect grew in the absence of pressure rather than the presence of force. In quieter moments, I thought about the path that led there. The night spent watching camera feeds. The urge to shout that I had learned to silence. The patience my grandfather must have practiced when the first developers tried to measure the land in profit instead of life. Boundaries, I realized, are not only lines on maps. They are decisions repeated calmly until they become reality. Legality had not been my weapon. It had been my anchor. The difference mattered. One fights, the other holds. The neighborhood itself changed in ways that were harder to quantify. Conversations became less guarded. The HOA, rebuilt with new leadership, shifted its focus toward shared maintenance rather than expansion. Meetings felt smaller, more practical. The idea of control gave way to the idea of coexistence. It was not perfect, but it was honest. The land and the community found a rhythm that did not require either to dominate the other. One morning, long after the last lawsuit filing had faded from public discussion, I walked to the old platform before sunrise. Fog hovered low over the water, turning the horizon into a pale line between gray and gold. The swamp sounded like it always had. Insects humming, distant birds calling, the quiet movement of unseen creatures beneath the surface. Then the familiar shape appeared near the reeds, the tagged number catching the first light. The alligator drifted lazily, basking without urgency, a presence older than every argument that had tried to claim the shoreline. He was not a threat. He was a reminder. Truth does not hurry. It waits, and when the noise clears, it is still there. I stood there until the sun broke fully above the trees, the water reflecting it without interruption. The land felt whole again, not because it had been defended, but because it had been understood. Home was no longer something I had to explain or protect with raised voices. It was simply where the boundaries made sense, where patience had done what anger never could. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fence Line File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?